You cannot serve from an empty vessel. This quote from author Eleanor Brown that we saw this morning was drilled into me throughout seminary. However, it's not just for ministers who need to learn this important fact. It's something we all, no matter who we are or what we do, need to remember. After this last year, it's natural to be drained. Our hearts are heavy and heartbroken. Our work is great and never ending. And it is so easy to drain ourselves to the point of burnout. How do we prevent that? The answer is simple, although it takes a lot of work. The full quote from Eleanor Brown gives us some insight. She says, "Rest and self-care are so important. When you take time to replenish your spirit, it allows you to serve others from the overflow. You cannot serve from an empty vessel." There are three parts to Brown's quote: rest, self-care, and replenishing the spirit. Rest is pretty easy to explain, so I'll only touch on that briefly. Now, this isn't laying down while reading the paper or watching the news. This is legitimate resting. Nothing that distracts you from the main purpose of resting. Toss on some Netflix or mindless television or music and just rest. Read a book that makes you happy. The main purpose of resting, legitimate resting, is to rest. And it sounds simple, but it does need to be intentional. This can be really hard if you've heard messaging your entire life that you're lazy if you're resting. And I encourage you to work through those messages either with a journal or a therapist, depending on how deeply those messages are entrenched. And if there are people in your life that you know struggle with this, the greatest gift you can give them is to encourage them to rest when they need it. It sounds simple, but for those of us who are struggling with that messaging, hearing permission is a blessing. And I'll give you that permission right now. Make sure you take time to rest this week, to really rest. Now, self-care is the stuff we do to take care of ourselves. Eating right, getting enough sleep, doing fun things, taking your medications on time and as directed, spending time with your family, spending time with friends, participating in hobbies or sports, those things that we may not be able to do right now and haven't been able to do for this year. So much like resting, I don't feel I need to go into too much detail here, but I will share what my colleague, Reverend Deborah Pope-Lance, says about self-care. If it doesn't feel even a little self-indulgent, you aren't doing enough. So when was the last time you did something for you that felt self-indulgent? This year has been hard on everyone. At this stage in COVID, we have all either lost someone or know someone who lost someone to this pandemic. And now, as we see a potential end in sight, we have to build in some time for self-care if you haven't already done so. So now let's talk about the last part of Eleanor Brown's list, replenishing the spirit. And I find it interesting that her list seems to be in order of what's easiest to what's hardest. Rest is pretty easy. Most of us get at least some sleep every night, and if not, your body will eventually force the point. Self-care, even when we don't call it that or do it intentionally, is something that we're doing without thinking of it. But replenishing the spirit, that takes a lot more intentionality. So what does it mean? At the start of seminary, we were given a list of spiritual practices to try, and just that, to try. From day one, it was stressed that the biggest part of spiritual practice is the second word, practice. It takes doing it on a regular basis. So we were encouraged to experiment with a spiritual practice we had not tried before, just for the first semester, and then we could switch to something else if we wanted to do so. The purpose was to find something that would feed our spirit during the beginning of the journey. Perhaps it would stick with us, but we had permission to set it down if it didn't. So what was that list we received? Well, I'm going to share it with you today because I really hope that it will encourage you to maybe try on a new spiritual practice. Now, at the top of the list are the ones you probably expect, prayer or meditation. Any form of prayer or meditation fits in this practice. As a young adult, prayer was my main spiritual practice. At the Bible college I attended, I could often be found in the upstairs chapel, deep in prayer for hours. For me, though, it was a conversation with someone I had a relationship with. It still is. My time as a chaplain intern a couple of years ago found me returning to my roots. I needed a spiritual practice to sustain me in deeper ways than I had found since coming into Unitarian Universalism. And so I began every shift in the chapel, praying for guidance, praying for strength, praying to find ways to share love and peace. I ended most shifts in the chapel, lifting up the families and the patients I'd encountered that day. Some shifts, I wandered into the chapel multiple times during the day. The chapel became my well, and I kept returning to it to fill mine. When I served a congregation, I would often wander into the quiet sanctuary during the day. I'd walk along the chairs praying for the community, for the country, for the world, for my beloved people. Do I think it manifests change? Yes, but the change is within me. That, for me, is the purpose of prayer. Over this last year, during the time spent at home, I've rediscovered my older form of prayer practice from my time in Bible college. I have a notebook, and within it, I write out my prayers and thoughts. And sure, it looks a lot like journaling, but there is a conversational quality there. There are various types of prayer and meditation that you can try, and they include centering prayer, passage meditation, mindfulness meditation, Tonglen, guided meditation, and Lectio Divina. Centering prayer is, according to Thomas Merton, prayer that is centered directly, entirely on the presence of God. It emphasizes interior silence. It's a form of monastic prayer that, according to Merton, begins not so much with considerations as with a return to the heart, finding one's deepest center, awakening the profound depths of our being. Passage meditation is based on a book by the same name, and it involves meditating on a passage in a text and carrying it with you throughout the day. And it's similar to the practice of Lectio Divina, which we'll touch on in a moment. Mindfulness meditation is a meditation where the focus is on the breath. And it's similar to centering prayer, but the focus is on the breath, not the silence. And this is the one I think many of us are familiar with. Tonglen is a Tibetan meditation technique taught more recently by Pema Chodron. It involves breathing in the suffering and breathing out joy. It involves taking on the suffering of those in the world and putting ourselves into a position to exchange ourselves for others. Now, guided meditation can be done by someone leading the meditation live via audio or video recording, or even by reading it yourself. And for me, this is the way that makes it easiest for me to meditate. My anxiety makes focusing on silence difficult. And so guided meditation is often how I have to do a meditation practice. You can do the same thing. If centering on breath and silence is too much, try a guided meditation. Finally, in this section is Lectio Divina. Now, this may be a new thing for you, so I want to take a moment to talk about it. Lectio Divina is Latin for divine reading, and it is often used with a sacred text and involves 4 steps. You read, you meditate on what you've read, you pray, and then you contemplate. In its earliest history, it was often done with scriptures. Now, however, it can be done with any passage that has meaning to you, a poem, a reading from a special text, or even a quote. All Souls New York City offers a daily email with a quote for use in a type of Lectio Divina practice. And the instructions with the email list, the steps are read, reflect, set an intention, and contemplate. Now, before you think that this is all there is for spiritual practices, let me tell you, you would be mistaken. Remember, spiritual practices are what feeds your spirit. And for some of us, we need movement to do that. So movement types of spiritual practices are, but not limited to, yoga, tai chi, dancing, walking meditation, labyrinth, and singing or chanting. Yoga and tai chi are pretty self-explanatory as why they are good spiritual practices. There's a component of being aware of your body and its position in space, that can be very grounding. I'm still working on making yoga a practice. It's really easy to skip a day or two, and then suddenly it's been a month. But over this last year, I spent 1 month doing yoga daily, and I definitely saw a difference, not just in my body, but also in my mind and spirit. My friend and colleague in Texas, the Reverend Aaron Walter, will be the first to tell you that dancing is a wonderful spiritual practice. She teaches a weekly Zumba class as part of her ministry, and she even had dancing as part of her ordination. A walking meditation, though, is more my speed, honestly. This is a form of meditation where instead of sitting still, you're walking slowly and paying attention to those things around you. You're not walking just to get somewhere or to rack up some miles for exercise. It's the journey that's important, not the destination. A beauty walk is a form of walking meditation. This is where you walk around the area, around your home, around your work, around your congregation, around your community. And during this walk, you take notice of things. The wildflowers growing along the road, the condition of sidewalks and how that varies depending on what neighborhood you're in, what kind of buildings and the state of them are in each area. It's really great for getting a sense of what goes on in your neighborhoods and how they are or aren't supported. A labyrinth takes a walking meditation, adds to it a specific walking pattern. Now, I love labyrinths. The statement I have always heard about them is the point of a maze is to find its center, and the point of a labyrinth is to find your center. At first glance, a labyrinth looks so simple, right? You're just walking around in circles and going towards the center, and then you come back out. But done purposely, it can be extremely moving because it reminds you that sometimes you have to walk back and forth to make progress forward. Now, singing and chanting, I know, are powerful spiritual practices. And over this last year, we've learned that that's hard to do, and we might not be able to do it right away when we return in person. But I love listening to chanting because even if I'm not doing it, my breathing slows, my body relaxes, and my mind calms. And while I'm not a singer, I know many, and they all say that having time to sing, to really open up and sing, brings them peace and gives them strength to continue on. There are many of our UU hymns that we love are on YouTube or on Spotify, or find them and sing in your home before we can get together and sing again in person. And yet, that is still not all. There are spiritual practices that are tied to creativity, journaling, making art, crafting. There's a practice that many of my friends do called morning pages. This is sitting down, preferably first thing in the morning, and simply writing whatever comes to your mind, wherever your thoughts take you, until you fill 3 pages without editing or judging. There are so many ways to make art and be creative that I'm not even going to begin to attempt to name them. But that thing, the one you're thinking about that you do sometimes, that you know is creative and makes your heart sing when you do it, yeah, that's your spiritual practice. For a period of time, knitting was my spiritual practice. And if I had a project that required just enough focus to keep from screwing up, but not so much that I would get frustrated, I could find myself slipping into a near meditative state. Spinning and weaving also do that for me, as does painting gaming miniatures. And yet there are still more spiritual practices from this list that I want to share with you. These are worship, gratitude, forgiveness, and keeping Sabbath. Now, worship is a pretty standard kind of spiritual practice. And I know that word's difficult for some, but remember what it means. It means to consider things of worth. When we come together on Sundays, whether here on Zoom or hopefully back in person at some point, we are collectively considering things of worth. This could mean something different for each person, but the main thing we all are all, by virtue of being Unitarian Universalists, that we consider of worth is the covenant of our community. We are held together by that power of covenant. And those who keep gratitude journals do this gratitude practice in a very intentional way, marking down 3 or 5 things they're grateful for each day. Forgiveness is exactly what it sounds like, although please remember, forgiveness is not giving someone a free pass for hurting you. It's releasing the hold they have on you and your heart. It's not letting them live rent-free in your head anymore. Forgiveness and gratitude are for us, to remind us of what we have and what we will allow within our life. Keeping Sabbath is a big one for me. Ever since the start of seminary, I have kept a Sabbath day. Now, not in the same vein as our Jewish friends, and I want to make that part clear. Arvid Straub says this about keeping Sabbath. All it means is that you take one day in the week where you don't do anything you're obligated to do. And this is a religious practice. You don't do anything that you're obligated to do. He goes on to say, we keep Sabbath by picking one day a week, doesn't have to be a Sunday, of no working and no chores, no shopping and no maintenance. It is time to rest, to enjoy family, friends, and loved ones. It is a time for reflection, a time for reading, for good food, playing, praying, and lovemaking. I am a huge believer in keeping Sabbath. For me, Fridays are my Sabbath. This is my time and I hold it close. Very few things break into that. Those things typically are General Assembly, ministerial chapter meetings, and sometimes class that's scheduled on a Friday. And when that happens, I reschedule my Sabbath. That's how important it is to me. Now, sometimes my partner's day off lands on my Sabbath. And on those days, we may do something together. But even then, it's something that refills my well. Some weeks, that means going for a walk in the woods. Some weeks, it means just hanging out in the hammock and chatting. But no matter what, my rules are no checking work email, no homework, and very little housework. It's a day for me to refill. My Sabbath keeping is intentional. I can tell when I've been unable to keep my Sabbath. I get cranky, I get frustrated easy, and I can't focus on what I need to do for the following week. So now that I've shared the list, I want to add an important perspective. During my first year of school, a colleague said something to me that helped me immensely. They said, and I'm paraphrasing here, your school will tell you, not necessarily explicitly, that spiritual practices are prayer, meditation, yoga, etc., quiet things. Yet those are spiritual practices, but they're not all of them. Anything that feeds your soul and that you desperately miss when you don't do it can be a spiritual practice. Only you know your well, and only you know what fills it. So that leads me to the questions I will leave you with, dear ones. What fills your well? What brings you joy? What things do you do that give you the strength to face the world one more day? And if you're struggling with those questions, then I invite you to take on one of the ones I mentioned, just to try, just to experiment. Susan Manker-Seal, in discussing the various spiritual practices she's used and later abandoned in her life, says, every change in my life has seemed to disrupt my pattern. And each time I've had to find out what fit my new situation. But even though I haven't kept up these practices regularly, I have learned from them, been shaped by them. They are tools, not ends. They help us learn to slow down, to pay attention, to focus, or to empty. They are not definitions of spirituality themselves. They are tools, not ends. If a tool isn't working for you, put it down and try another one. Only you know your well, and only you know what fills it. You cannot serve from an empty vessel. This world needs us to serve, to heal it, and we can only do that if our wells are full. Come back to the well. Amen. Blessed be, and may it be so.